Question. If we ask billions of people questions like who or what God is, we will get billions of different options, no matter how profound our sight. So are we not asking questions that cannot be answered? But we have to admit we have a question we can talk about forever and never have an answer. Ha 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 ha. I assume that's meant to be a evil laughter. So you can add that yourself. But I think this comment is actually very interesting because it touches about some things I've been thinking about for a very long time. So if we ask people questions, we get different answers. So are we not asking a question that cannot be answered? Are we not asking many different questions as spiritual people that can't be answered? Well, if you look at this from the linear mind, then yes, we're asking a lot of questions that can't be answered. What do I mean with that? I mean, the linear mind will always say there are certain conditions that we are using as a foundation for asking the question. And there's a certain logic, there are certain rules, and if we follow those rules, it will lead to a specific answer. And there's only one right answer. What is God? The linear mind will say there has to be some truth there. Either there is no God, or there is a God, and then God is a specific way, like, for example, the God of the Old Testament, or the God of the Hindu scriptures, or whatever. But that's the linear mind. And it's perfectly true. If you ask questions with a linear mind, there will be many questions that don't have an answer. But that's because the linear mind has certain limitations. You see, how can you ask a question? Just think about this. How can you ask a question? You'll say, well, I'm asking a question because there's something I don't know and I want to know it. But if you knew absolutely nothing, how could you ask a question? You have to know something to even be able to formulate a question. But what you know will influence the question you are asking and the answer you are hoping for. I have met thousands of people over the many years I've been on the spiritual path, myself included for many years, who had in their minds that there was a certain idea that had to be right. And whenever they were asking questions, they were not really asking a neutral question. How is this? They were asking a question, validate my viewpoint. They were trying to find validation for what they thought things should be like. It's like you are trying to validate the view of life that you have instead of discovering a higher view. And you can see this all over. You can see fundamentalist Christians who only want to look at what validates their view of the literal interpretation of the Bible. You can see scientific materialists that are only looking for what validates the materialistic worldview. And of course, many, many versions in between. So what I have done in several videos, I have given this concept of a reality simulator. And there are two kinds of basic experiences we can have in a simulator. One is the immersion experience, and one is the awakening experience. And when we are in this immersion, we think this is the real world and this is the way it is, and the way we look at the world is right. Namely, that we are victims of these outer conditions. We're only looking for validation. We're not open to something beyond. But when we have had enough of that experience, the immersion experience, we can shift into the awakening phase. And now the important point in the awakening phase is to ask these questions that are open-ended, that are neutral. So go back to the question. Are we not asking questions that cannot be answered? But you see, in the immersion phase, it's important that a question is answered based on the conditions or the knowledge that caused you to formulate the question. And you want validation for the worldview that you use to formulate the question. So your purpose for asking a question is to get a specific answer. That's the highest answer, that's the only true answer. When you go into the awakening phase, your purpose is not to get a specific answer, or rather, ideally, it isn't. Your purpose is to get an answer that helps you raise your consciousness, your awareness. Expand your mind, expand your worldview. Because when you expand your worldview, you can formulate a better question. And then you can get a higher answer. And this process is ongoing at least for as long as we are on Earth, not even beyond. So you see here, if you take the typical first grader who's learning multiplication and subtraction, addition and subtraction, what kind of questions can that first grader ask about math? So if the first grader developed this idea, now I understand addition and subtraction, I don't need to learn, there's nothing more to understand about math. It would never learn anything, right? But as you increase your awareness of a topic, when you know more about the topic, you can ask more precise questions. And therefore, you can rise to a higher understanding of math or any topic. And it's the same thing here with the spiritual path. We all start at a certain level. We shift from being immersed to realizing there must be something. Most spiritual people I met, thousands of people, they grew up in, for example, Christianity. And at some point they realize, this can't answer my questions. There must be more to understand about the spiritual side of life than what's said in Christianity, or for that matter, scientific materialism. And they looked for something, and then they found something because they were open. Now they find a spiritual teaching or a spiritual guru, and they immerse themselves in that. They study that for a while. They take this all in. But what happens for most people is that after some time, this is certainly what happened for me, that teaching, which for a time really expanded my mind, it had now given me some knowledge that allowed me to ask some higher questions that I couldn't even imagine a few years ago. And so now, based on these questions, I found another teaching that could answer those questions. And as I said, this process is not going to end as long as we are on Earth if we are open. What happens to some spiritual people is, of course, they get attached to a certain guru or a certain answer. They think this is the highest. Now I have the highest. This is the linear mind again that wants to say, but there must be a teaching that's the highest teaching. But there is no teaching that's the highest you can grasp while you're on Earth. If you really want to go, you have to put that idea out of your mind. That's the linear mind, because it wants to stop your growth at a certain level. If you're really committed to growth, you are always looking for something beyond. And you're always realizing that you can receive some intuitive impulses from your higher self or from your spiritual teachers that help you ask a broader question, a higher question. And it was very, very profound for me to realize this connection between the questions we ask depend on what we know and how we look at life. You go back, take science. In the Middle Ages, their main worldview was that the Earth is flat. And there were certain questions they couldn't even think to ask. They couldn't even imagine them. But then they started making these observations of the heavenly bodies moving, and they realized it didn't really fit with a worldview that the Earth was the center of the universe. So then they started asking some more profound questions. And then gradually came this shift, and then all of a sudden Newton comes out, Isaac Newton, and he is asking, based on what has been achieved up until that point, he's asking some different questions that Galileo couldn't imagine, for example. So he comes up with a new view of the world. And for a time, physicists were building onto this view, and in the late 1800s, they believed we have now discovered the final worldview of how the world actually works, based on Newton's laws of motion and particles and this and that. But there were a few questions that they couldn't really answer within that paradigm. And one day Einstein is considering one of these questions, and he's hit with this intuitive insight that helps him to develop the theory of relativity. And all of a sudden, instead of being focused on particles, now physics is focused on energy and the quantum world, and it's taken to another level. But now, we physicists have been treading water for decades because they still haven't really been willing to ask questions beyond the materialistic paradigm. So, as science claims it was limited by the Catholic doctrines in the Middle Ages, now science is just as limited, even more limited, by the materialistic doctrines. And there are questions that they either can't formulate because they don't dare to look beyond, or they don't really dare to research them. Of course, there are some scientists that do. Bernardo Kastrup and what's his name? Can't remember his name right now. They are asking these questions about consciousness, and this is the next step for science, to ask another set of questions that aren't limited by the materialistic paradigm. And it's the same thing for spiritual people. There comes a point where we have to say that the teaching we have had so far has helped us reach a certain level. But perhaps we need to ask questions that cannot be answered within that teaching and go beyond that level. And if we do that, we attain growth. And if we don't, we stagnate. And I've seen many people over the years stagnate for years or decades because they couldn't let go of this outer teaching. They felt that all of their questions should be answered within the teaching. And therefore they weren't open to the next teacher, for the next teacher to appear to them. So, it also says here, we have to admit we have a question we can talk about forever and never have an answer. Well, but, if talking about it helps us raise our awareness, look at it from different angles, understand it so that we can ask more precise questions, then this process still helps us grow. Because the way I look at it is, again, this is a shift you come to when you walk the spiritual path, is that it's not about finding the final answer. It's about finding a higher answer than you have grasped so far. And that only happens when you open your mind to the possibility that there could be a higher answer. And you can say we can talk about it forever. Yes, if you talk about it within a certain paradigm. You talk about in business, there's a glass ceiling. You can't go beyond the glass ceiling. But you could say that on the spiritual path. If you are attached to a particular outer teaching and you believe that all your questions should be answered by that teaching because the guru has to be the highest guru, then you have created a glass ceiling. And your mind can't go beyond it. So if you accept that glass ceiling, that paradigm, you can talk about it forever without finding an answer. But when you are willing to go beyond, it's not necessarily you'll find a final answer to the question, but you might find a higher answer. Or you might be able to ask a higher question that makes the previous question become obsolete. Or you might simply see that the question was asked from a limited perspective. And therefore, you now have a higher perspective and the question just fades away. It's not important anymore. So, really you can say that, this was a very, very profound shift for me, where I shifted away from the linear mind wanting to always have a final answer, where I realized that the real way to go beyond the question is that the question becomes obsolete. It just fades away because now you have a wider view. It's like you're inside a bunker and there's this little periscope that you are seeing through. and you're seeing a little bit of the sky at the time, just a little bit. And you can move it a little bit, but obviously you can't see the whole night sky. So you're thinking there's that star, and there's that star, and there's that star. And you're asking yourself, is this all there is to the universe? I want a final answer. Is this all there is to the universe? But you can't get that answer from inside the bunker. But if you step outside the bunker and you're looking up into this totality of the night sky, the question is this, is what I saw from inside the bunker, the final view, it just fades away. You're realizing, no, there's so much more to know. And so my point is, the purpose of asking questions is not to get a final answer. It's to raise our awareness. And then it is never wasted to ask questions.